right. Hello, everyone. I've got a lot of content to get through, so I'm going to move fast. Buckle in. If you are looking for a startup idea right now, I'm going to try to help. But more importantly, I'm going to try to give you the conceptual tools to think about startup ideas in a sophisticated way, the way that we think about them at YC. Here's the thing. No one, not even YC, knows for sure which ideas will succeed. And in any case, if your idea succeeds, has as much to do with how well you execute as your initial idea anyway. But certain ideas are much more likely to succeed than others. And so my goal here is to help you stack the deck in your favor by starting with a promising idea. The advice in this talk came from several places. First, I analyzed the top 100 YC companies by valuation, and I looked at how they all got their idea. So I started with some hard quantitative data on how recent billion-dollar companies actually came up with their idea. It also draws on a classic essay by Paul Graham that I really recommend. It's called How to Get Startup Ideas. It also comes from helping YC companies that pivot in the middle of the batch and learning over the years what advice helps them to find a new good startup idea. And then finally, it comes from reading thousands of YC applications that we rejected and looking at the mistakes that caused good founders to come up with bad ideas. And those are the mistakes I want to help you all avoid. This talk's got 3 parts. First, I'm going to tell you the most common mistakes founders make with startup ideas. Then I'm going to talk about how to know if your idea is good, and then about how to come up with new ones. Okay, the 4 most common mistakes with startup ideas. So the most common mistake is just building something that doesn't solve a real problem for your users. Typically, you can articulate the problem that you're solving, you can put it in words, but when you actually go and talk to the users, it's just not something that they really care about. We call it a solution in search of a problem, or a SISP. Let's go through an example. So a lot of founders come up with an idea with this kind of thought process. They go, AI is cool. What could I apply AI to? And then they go look for a problem that they could solve with AI. That's a solution in search of a problem. And the reason it's dangerous is that if you do that, you'll probably find a problem, but it will be a superficially plausible problem. It'll be a made up problem that people don't really care about, rather than a real problem that people actually care about. And if people don't really care about the problem, they won't really care about your solution. So instead, you want to fall in love with a problem. The best way to find a startup idea is to start with a high quality problem. Now, sometimes founders hear this and they decide to interpret that as guidance to work on some huge societal problem, global poverty or something. No doubt, those are real problems, but they're too abstract to make good starting points for startup ideas. You need something that's more specific, something that's tractable with a startup. The next mistake is getting stuck on what we call tar pit ideas. What's a tar pit idea? So there's this certain set of common startup ideas that have been around for forever. They have been applying in droves to YC batch after batch for years. And when founders start working on these ideas, it's like they've gotten stuck in tar. They never seem to go anywhere. So we call them tar pit ideas. Here's what causes tar pit ideas. They all form around some widespread problem that lots of potential founders encounter. And it's a problem that seems like it could be easily solved with a startup, but it's an illusion. There's actually a structural reason why it's very hard or impossible to solve, which is why, after all these years, no one has solved it. And you can see why ideas like this would be so dangerous, why they will cause so many founders to waste months of their life stuck in a tar pit. They're very tantalizing from a distance because they're so superficially plausible as startup ideas. Here's a concrete example. This is a very common tar pit idea that's been applying to YC for 20 years. This is the stereotypical college student idea. And it goes like this. You think, man, every Friday or Saturday night when I'm making plans to meet up with my friends, it's so inefficient. I'm in all these different text threads and chat groups, and we're trying to make plans to meet up. I'm just going to make an app to make it more efficient. Well, it turns out that there are some structural reasons why this idea is hard, which is why in 20 years of people applying to YC with this idea, nobody has actually pulled it off. You can see why so many people have been attracted to it. It's a problem that almost everyone encounters at some point, and it seems like it would be so easy to solve. You can just imagine the app. It's just got a list of events and you invite friends to it. It seems so simple. The thing about tar pit ideas is that they are not necessarily impossible. I'm even open-minded that somebody will eventually make the app to meet up with your friends idea work. is more accurate to think of them as common ideas that are much harder than they seem. So if you want to work on one, here's my advice. First, Google it. It's amazing how many founders skip the step of just like Googling for their own startup idea to see who has worked on it in the past. You should find who's worked on this in the past and actually talk to them if you can. Try to figure out what the hard part of this idea is that has caused other people to not be able to solve it yet. The next mistake is simple. It is amazing how many founders will basically just like jump into the first idea they have without even stopping to consider whether it would actually make a good business. But more dangerous is the founders on the opposite side of the spectrum who sit around waiting for the perfect startup idea. And of course, there is no such thing. So these people just never actually start a company. So if you imagine that there's like a spectrum between picking the first idea that comes to mind and waiting for the perfect idea, and somewhere in the middle, there's this like happy place, which is the place that you want to be, right? And the way that Paul Graham put this is that you should think of your idea as a good starting point. No startup idea is perfect, and no matter what you start with, it's probably going to morph anyway. So you just want to have an initial idea that has enough interesting qualities that can morph in the right direction. So now suppose you have a startup idea and you want to know if it's good. I'm going to give you a framework for this, and the format of the framework is 10 key questions to ask about any startup idea. So the first one is, do you have founder market fit? If I had to pick like one most important criteria, it'd probably be this one. And what I mean by founder market fit is just, are you the right team to be working on this idea? And a great example of what good founder market fit looks like is PlanGrid. So PlanGrid makes an iPad app to view construction blueprints. And two of the founders of PlanGrid were Tracy and Ralph. And Tracy had worked in the construction industry and she knew a lot about construction. And Ralph was an awesome developer who was like the perfect person to build this iPad app. If you were going to imagine a team to start PlanGrid, the team that you would imagine would look, something like that. And that's what good founder market fit looks like. It's like this team is obviously the right team to work on the idea. In fact, founder market fit is so important that I would recast your search for a startup idea. When most people go to pick a startup idea, they try to look for a good startup idea like in the abstract. And instead, I would think about this exercise as an exercise to pick a good idea for your team. You with me? It doesn't matter if something is a good startup idea for someone else if it's not a good idea for your team. So you may as well just look for ideas that you would actually be good at executing. Okay, number 2, how big is the market? Obviously, you need a big market, which for startups typically means like $1 billion market. But actually, less obviously, there are 2 kinds of markets for startups that are good. Ones that are big now and ones that are small but rapidly growing. And an example of the second one is Coinbase. So when Coinbase got started in 2012, the Bitcoin trading market was minuscule. But even at that time, it was pretty obvious that if Bitcoin succeeded the way people hoped that it would, that this would eventually be a $1 billion market. Number 3, how acute is this problem? So as I said earlier, the most common mistake is just like working on something that just isn't really a problem, or it's just not a problem that people care enough about. Here's an example of the opposite. Here's an example of what a good problem looks like. Brex. So Brex, from winter 2017, makes a credit card for startups. And before Brex, if a startup in YC wanted a corporate credit card, they literally could not get one because no bank would give a credit card to a startup. That's a good problem. Like if the alternative to your solution is literally nothing, that's what a good problem looks like. Okay, next, do you have competition? Now, most founders think that if you have competition, that's bad. But counterintuitively, it is the opposite. Most good startup ideas have competition. But if you are going up against especially entrenched competition, you typically need a new insight. Next one is like, do you want this personally? Do you know people personally who want this? It's amazing how often people start companies where the answer to both these questions is no. If that's the case, you definitely got to worry that, maybe nobody wants this. So definitely time to go talk to some users. Did this only recently become possible or only recently become necessary? So something has recently changed in the world, like a new technology, a regulatory change, or a new problem. That is often what creates a new opportunity. And a great example of this is a company called Checkr, which does background checks via an API. So it's an API for doing background checks on people. And roughly the story of Checkr is delivery services like DoorDash and Instacart and Uber started to take off. And they were all hiring huge pools of delivery people and workers, and they needed to run background checks on all of these people. And there were, at the time, already a bunch of large existing companies that run background checks, but they weren't well suited for this very new use case. And that is like exactly the kind of change in the world that creates a new opportunity. Let's talk about proxies. So a proxy is a large company that does something similar to your startup, but it is not a direct competitor. And so a good example of this in practice is a company called Rappi, which does food delivery in Latin America. And when Rappi got started, there were already food delivery companies in other parts of the world like DoorDash. They were doing very well. They just hadn't caught on in Latin America yet. And so DoorDash was a great proxy to show that this idea of doing food delivery in Latin America would probably work. Is this an idea you'd want to work on for years? But this is a tricky one. Like, sure, if the answer to this question is yes, that's a good sign. But often it's not. Often an idea grows on founders over time as it starts to work. As I'm going to talk about in a moment, a lot of the best startup ideas are in boring spaces like tax accounting software or something like that. Like no one is particularly passionate about. Like nobody starts off being passionate about tax accounting software. But tax accounting software is probably a good business. And if you're actually running a successful business, you tend to become passionate about it over time. Okay, is this a scalable business? So if you're building pure software, the answer is yes, because software scales infinitely and you can just like check this one off. The place where founders most often get into trouble here is with services businesses like agencies or dev shops, anything that requires like high skill human labor in order to serve your customers. Okay, and my last question is this a good idea space? Which of course means I need to tell you what an idea space is. This is a concept from my colleague Dalton, who you'll hear from later in this course. An idea space is like one level of abstraction out from a particular startup idea. It is a class of closely related startup ideas, like software for hospitals, or infrastructure monitoring tools, or food delivery services. And here's the thing. Different idea spaces have wildly different hit rates. Over the last 10 years, if you started a company that did like fintech infrastructure or vertical SaaS for enterprise, the probability that your company became a billion-dollar company was astonishingly high. Whereas if you started something in consumer hardware or social networks or ad tech, the success rate was like orders of magnitude lower. Now, I can't say that that will continue to be the case for those specific areas because spaces flip from hot to cold over time. But it is still worth thinking about picking a good idea space. And a good idea space is really just one that like you expect is going to have a reasonable hit rate for new startup ideas and one that has founder market fit. That way, even if your initial idea isn't quite right, there are probably good adjacent ideas that you can sort of like drift into. I'm going to give a good example of like how this played out in practice. So a good example of picking a good idea space is this company called Fivetran from YC Winter 13. And basically the story of Fivetran is they started making this tool for data analysis. And they went to some companies and they tried to sell it, and the companies didn't want it. So they pivoted and they built a different tool for data analysis. And they went back to the same companies and they tried to sell them that one. And the companies didn't want that either. But each time they went to companies and tried to sell them some tool for data analysis, they would learn more about what those companies actually wanted. And so eventually they sort of stumbled into an actual problem, into an actual tool for data analysis that companies actually wanted. And this is why picking a good idea space to start with is so important. Like, because the Fivetran founders were shopping for ideas in a fertile idea space, they put themselves in a good position to like bump into a good startup idea. If they had picked a bad idea space, they probably wouldn't have found anything. Okay, before I talk about how to generate startup ideas, I've got one important topic to tell you about. These are 3 things that make your startup idea seem bad. Okay, before I